Уважаемые коллеги, добрый день. Прежде всего хочу вас поздравить с высокими назначениями в правительство Российской Федерации.
Vladimir Putin's proposed constitutional changes went from non-existent to fully drafted in less than a week. New Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin names a new cabinet that looks a lot like the old one, and Russia gets a new prosecutor general as Yuri Chaika gets a new job. It seems we've got some new data points to look at as Putin's Operation Regime Preservation gathers steam. Hello from SIPA headquarters in Washington, D.C., and welcome to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. And joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA, and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University.
Nice to be back,
welcome,
Brian.
Don. Also joining us here in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SNIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming back. So we got a new government. With most of the key, not all, but most of the key posts, most notably the power ministries pretty much remaining the same. Yuri Chaika, in an interesting shift here, Yuri Chaika stepped down as prosecutor general and was replaced by Igor Krasnov, who I think is an interesting figure, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later, who appears to be a pretty interesting figure. Chaika will become the presidential representative for the North Caucasus, which is also interesting. And then there was the drafting of those constitutional changes on a working group that included athletes and celebrities who put them together in 5 days, got them over to the Duma today. It's Thursday we're recording. They were passed today, January 23rd. And the second reading will be February 11th. Pretty remarkable speed for this. It's almost like they worked this out in advance. Maria, they're clearly not wasting any time. What jumped out at you in this week's developments? What new data points jumped out? Have you seen anything that's changed our initial assessment?
First of all, we have the constitutional changes and how they all developed from what we have discussed last time. And of course, the government appointments, where we see a different dynamic playing out. So first of all, on the speed, I 100% agree. It's actually absolutely remarkable how quickly the working group, which
Putin gave a speech on the 15th. The working group finished this work by the 20th, and by the 23rd, they've already passed. They met once.
Very efficient working group. And now we actually just passed, the Duma have just passed them on the first hearing.
I didn't see anything in what was passed in today's first reading that surprised me or changed my initial assessment of what was going on. You?
Unanimous vote. I mean, again, this is State Duma appointed by Putin, essentially purposefully appointed to vote unanimously. On the amendments they arguably haven't really seen up until last week. Well, I mean, we certainly see the resolution, right? So the observers asking...
To see it in writing, though, that was a little different than hearing Putin say in a speech. Good.
2 points, 100% agree. So why now? We have discussed that a little bit right now.
Right.
Why so fast? And what is different from the changes that Putin announced in his federal address? So it all looks like a little bit like a security operation that Putin organized. It is very clear that he has certain vision in mind. We are not very clear about what that vision is, but he seems to be more or less certain, because otherwise the speed is impossible.
The speed is impossible, exactly.
Now, what we see, the most important and the most interesting question we discussed last time is State Council, right? Some people were disappointed not to see the authority of State Council mentioned more explicitly in the article, in the chapter 1 of the Constitution, which delegates the authority to the state institutions. However, it is not by coincidence, since that chapter is impossible to change. The State Council will, according to this vague premise, have some coordinating role of other ministries and the general direction of the country, which again does not contradict what we said before. Some people have argued that in fact the presidential authority has been substantively reinforced as a result of these changes. As a matter of fact, we do not see as much power delegated to the level of the parliament as opposed to what we have expected. The president, however, now has almost the power to dismiss the constitutional court judges. He actually can propose to dismiss them to the Federation Council. So essentially that is a power a lot of people have actually have been very critical of. But let's be honest, in the Russian unfortunate realities of Russia are that the Constitutional Court, with its head Zorkin, often nicknamed Pazorkin,
Right.
is not very independent by far either way. So as important as those changes are, I would not overemphasize them, arguably.
No, the state council is given a coordinating role. That there is power in that. I mean, what were the formal functions of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, quite frankly? Right? I mean, it wasn't really a strong formal position as drafted. Stalin made it a strong formal position. So I think, I mean, and I'm still, I'm watching this, but I want to wait till the cake is kind of more fully baked, because it seems to me, like we said last week, Putin's keeping his options open. He's creating multiple centers of power, and wherever he goes is going to be the one that is powerful, one would presume. Don, would you agree?
I very much agree, and I'm shocked and amazed, and I would say a loss to understand why so much time this week has been given to, forgive me, Maria, the debate about the constitutional niceties. I think it's vague. You're absolutely right. It was pre-cooked, and I think it's important, but I think the real important are the power dynamics that lie behind it.
Well, what we
the
saw
three
this
of
week
us
was
have
the
talked a lot about informal versus formal politics, which is absolutely, I think, what's going on here. And so, Maria, forgive me, yes, you're right about the Security Council. We've talked about it. I don't think what the formal powers mean all that much, but I very much agree with both of you, Brian, in particular, that Putin is not yet decided, I think. Things are very vague. And I think it's very inaccurate, misleading to take a Western understanding of separation of powers or constitutionalism and force it on a system that's so personal, so highly informal, as Brian and I have talked about, and you and I have talked
Absolutely
about.
true, but then it is even more puzzling. Why is he doing all these
why
changes?
is he doing it now? That's actually a really interesting
Well,
question.
he's getting ahead
and does he need to do it?
He's getting ahead of the 2024 question.
Yes,
he's got to have this done before the Duma elections in 21, absolutely. And he's keeping, I mean, I see two places, and I don't rule out that he goes to both places, the Security Council and the State Council. I could see Putin taking both of those positions easily, stepping back as president, creating a mechanism by which de facto the Siloviki basically report to the Security Council. There's all sorts of things that can be done here, both formally and informally.
As we've seen with the Security Council now, he consults sometimes with a subgroup of them or people he wants to consult with. So it's a much more fluid situation, I think. I saw, did he not this morning make Putin comment about the need for a strong presidency?
Well, no, there was a comment he made yesterday, which really caught my attention. He was asked if he could follow the example of Kazakhstan. He was explicitly asked this. Where where Nazarbayev stepped down and but continued to call the shots from another prominent position. Putin said the following: the emergence of a position above the presidency would mean dual power, which is absolutely unacceptable for a country like Russia. This is the first thing that caught my eye. I was now is that diversion? Is that Moskarovka? Maria, what do you've been watching Russian leaders lie your entire life. What did you make of that?
Especially, I would be very cautious interpreting, taking
Putin
literally. One more point, right? A lot of people would argue that given as a result of these amendments, the president's positions actually is not weaker, if not stronger. Some people argue that he actually is reinforcing the presidential position for himself, the office for himself, but he cannot do that.
How is he going to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
He could do it, but it wouldn't fit his pattern of behavior up until now.
And not under the current amendments. The current amendments explicitly do not allow the current president to continue for the next
That's true, under the new amendments. Now, there have been some suggestions that basically, with the new amendments, it resets the whole thing all over again, and he gets to start all over and have two more terms.
But the specific ruling,
that would be blunt.
That would be too blunt for Putin. Yeah, I agree. And also under the Yelena Lukyanova, the Russian constitutional lawyer, actually had an explanation about that just yesterday. She says there was an explicit ruling early on under Yeltsin's years by the Constitutional Court. I mean, again, we are very cautious about, referencing to the law in Russia, but that explicitly stated that unless said otherwise, he cannot continue.
So why does Putin say this?
Maria, do we think he's made up his mind yet?
No, we don't.
I don't think so.
We don't. But one thing we can be pretty sure of, I think, is that he's not going to remain president if he, I mean, he just created the legislative basis for him not to remain president, and then he turns around and violates that. That would be kind of weird, even for him. Right?
And of course, formally, he will still be right. I mean, to your question, whether that is maskirovka or, some kind of disinformation, he will not continue as a head of power. There will be formally one head of power.
And the informal
and then there will be informal, all kind of type, indirect type. I think the Libyan president, Gaddafi, was playing the same game when asked by his elites to resign. He would always say that I would love to, but I'm not really holding any official positions. That's so I'm not. It's not in my capacity to do. So I think it's very, very much in line.
It's been said that in Russia, it matters who has control of the pechat, of the stamp, right? Who has that office that can formally sign off on things. And can Putin rule without control of the pechat, if you will?
That's a very important question. I guess it's for us to see. Nobody really understands how the Russian system works unless tried, right?
Right.
What we do see, first of all, you have started the very important Soviet parallels, which I think are really direct here, right? The Politburo, the Security Council, and the Central Committee of the party as the new edition of the State Council. The State Committee, by the way, has never been mentioned in the Stalinist constitution, for example, and yet it allowed it to function and be the de facto decision-making body for quite some time. Again, and going back to that, right? Again, Stalin or many other Russian rulers in the past did not necessarily hold an official position.
Yeah, no, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Politburo, the Central Committee, none of that was in the Soviet Constitution, but that was all covered by Article 6 that said the Communist Party of the Soviet Union is the guiding organization of the society. So that was the creation. The Politburo was in the Communist Party's organizing documents. It wasn't in the Constitution of the Soviet Union. So but again, this. I'm wondering how much of the formal authority does one need in Russia to rule? And I don't know the answer to this question.
Well, one thing for certain, you need to control Silovikis.
Exactly. You have to control the people with the guns. And Don, you want to jump in?
This is an extremely interesting conversation. 2 points to a question, really. To what I have always argued for many years that the tension between formal and informal politics is something that pops up unexpectedly. Russia, yes, it's an authoritarian regime, but the formal powers we've just described, Brian, you just described, on paper, president, whatever, they create what do the lawyers say, a claim to some kind of actual authority. My second point would be this issue of comparing it to Libya, Iran, and Kazakhstan. Is the relationship between the people and voting and a directly elected president sort of the same in Russia as there? And I would argue no. And I think that Putin is taking a chance by going off to the side and having them elect somebody else. This is really a vulnerability in the system because I think there's a potential for Putin to lose legitimacy and authority quickly if he moves to the side.
Think of how much, he did lose a bit when he did the castling with Medvedev.
But people sort of knew, other than the U.S. administration, people sort of knew who was really in charge. But it's an interesting question. You and you do a lot of work on public opinion. This issue of the legitimating factor of voting for the elite is very important. And now he's taking a gamble.
Well, this is something I want to get into.
And I don't have a good answer.
I want to dive deep into this in the second half when we're talking about succession, because we're getting into ideology and legitimacy and things that this are not really going to solve. But I want to put that off for a whole conversation we're going to have after the break. What I did want to do before we got there, it's kind of not as exciting, but we'll get to the exciting stuff later. You look at the cabinet. Who's in? Who's out? Maria? What jumped out at me? Dmitry Kozak out. That is Putin's. You're from Petersburg. I lived in Petersburg. Dima Kozak is Putin's right hand. He is Putin's Mr. Fix-It. I am curious to see where Kozak goes. Aren't you? Because he's not going away. I don't, and I'm curious about that. Anything else jump? Oreshkin, who was once seen as a rising star, who was the economic development minister in the old cabinet, him going out was interesting. Medinsky, a controversial to say the least figure as the culture minister.
Applause appropriate here.
Applause appropriate. Anything else jump out at you?
So definitely agree that these provocative, controversial personalities like Medinsky and former Minister of Education Olga Vasilyeva
Right.
out. This is good news. Also kind of goes along with more populist nature of Putin's first half of Putin's presidential address. Like not to try to, annoy the population in the situation where the popularity is already kind of erode.
I get rid of Oreshkin in that situation.
Oreshkin, I think, is viewed as a more liberal economically, and instead we see that the new vice prime minister, I think, is Andrei Belousov, and he is a very interesting personality and arguably the most powerful minister in this cabinet. A long-term Putin's ally, enjoys Putin's personal affinity, big supporter of Crimea annexation, the only one of the economic bloc, tough statesman, and also a big believer in this Russia being a besieged fortress. He is very likely to start these expensive Keynesian types of policies to promote the national projects. And it's rumored that one of the reasons for Medvedev's dismissal was a complete failure with administering the national projects, and also potential start spending the National Welfare Fund. So the key concern, and again, that actually related to the legitimacy issues that we have discussed, is that Russia's economy is stagnating. It's growing very slow. And there is no outside source of investments due to sanctions, and also, frankly, the contribution that the Kremlin played in this, right? There's no stupid US investors or Western investors who are actually dare to invest in Russia after everything that happened. And so instead, they're going to be using this active domestic investment in an effort to boost economy, which very commonly, as we know, actually ends up in rising prices, inflation. The success of these policies are not a given.
I don't see this as reviving the economy, but
there's no. What else? Exactly. What else are they to do? But two important things about Belousov is that he is controversial for two reasons. First of all, he's the author of this very famous and very unpopular, notorious idea of seizing super profits from the commodity companies back in 2018 in an effort to implement Putin's actually May decrees at the time. So this actually is likely be continuation of the same policies he proposed, and of course his indirect connection to the Barrington Vostok scandal, where he is rumored to be the friend with Artem Avitisyan, who actually initiated the whole case against Calvi.
Now, the other personnel move that I found fascinating, of course, is Chaika and Krasnov. Yuri Chaika, the long-serving justice minister, is being moved to the North Caucasus Federal District, which is interesting in itself. But let's kind of bracket that. The appointment of Krasnov as the new prosecutor general. First of all, he's very young. But I was looking through his career. He investigated the attempted assassination of Chubais back in 2005. He investigated the killings of human rights attorney Stanislav Markelov and Novaya Gazeta journalist Anastasia Baburova in 2006. And he gained a lot of praise from the human rights community for that. In fact, there's a quote in Medusa, Inur Sharapov, who's a lawyer for the Agora Human Rights Group, the Kazan-based human rights group, called him, quote, a cool Fed. He's a cool Fed. When do you hear a human rights?
Prikolny Fed.
Yeah, Prikolny Fed. Happen often, yeah.
Prikolny Federal, I guess is what he said. But he then investigated the assassination of Boris Nemtsov and was praised for getting the actual triggermen, and was not really blamed for not getting the Zakashik, the people who ordered it. And he did that in a joint investigation with the FSB's so-called Counterterrorism and Constitutional Defense Second Service. He has a reputation for getting along with a lot of people in different institutions in a world where the Siloviki and interagency rivalries are pretty fierce. Maria, how do you read this? Don, I want to get you in here too.
when it comes to Siloviki's reshuffling, it's a little bit tricky. So first of all,
We need
Chaika,
Mark Galeotti here.
yeah, definitely, he'd be great. One thing is Chaika left also because he's 68, and I think the threshold on the age to be in that position is 70 years old.
So for retirement, they sent him to the North Caucasus.
Yeah, that is ironic, and certainly does not look like a promotion, frankly,
Right.
to me. Unlike what we have discussed with Medvedev, for example, last time. Another interesting thing is, again, it looks to me, given that Krasnov is relatively quite unprecedentedly popular with, as you said, very different circles in Russia. Again, this looks a little bit like this populist move, trying to actually appeal to different social groups in the society, as it kind of goes along with the same dismissal of the unpopular ministers that we mentioned who we mentioned about.
But so they're throwing a bone to the liberals? Is that what this is? I mean, I'm suspicious of anything that looks like that. But I when I read up, and what's interesting about Krasnov is he seems to be respected by people in the human rights community and the liberal part of the society, and among among the Siloviki.
This actually goes in line with a couple small announcements that Putin made recently, which decriminalize a little bit certain types of economic activities, and also the prescription of drugs by the doctors, also a little bit eased. So in this sense, it seems to be some kind of a bone, exactly as you said. It's also interesting, some people have pointed out that Krasnov is from the investigative committee, right? The institution that used to compete with the prosecution office.
He was actually in the investigative committee before it was cool. Basically, before Bastrykin took it over and turned it into what it has become. He was in it when it was kind of a smaller operation inside the prosecutor's office.
So, yeah, some would argue this is perhaps a merging back of those two structures, maybe not.
And then some of the speculation I saw was that he's to give the prosecutor general more of an oversight role of this whole law enforcement apparatus.
We'll see how that works. Right?
Don, what did you
I agree. But when you see the word Chaika, you're always thinking Bastrykin, and people are sort of waiting for the other
shoe to drop.
Shoe to drop, absolutely. Just a couple points.
So does Bastrykin go down, you think?
Yeah, what Maria said. I think, as always, you see balance among the various forces. They attempt to maintain balance, even if they're new faces. There's this hilarious Brian and Maria chart in Open Media today where they have a little symbol, who's who and what clan or association do they have, with Medvedev being identified with a duck. And very interesting. But again, balance. I agree with you, Brian, that there's going to be not much of a prospect for reform. And third, I find very interesting Chemezov and Sobyanin in the comments about both of them. Sobyanin in one place being talked about as missing historic opportunity to be prime minister. Yes. Another place, including Open Media, saying he's strengthened. So I think
there's more of his people in this cabinet, which is interesting.
But I think personally he's weakened. And finally, Chemezov, who has been relatively outspoken by Kremlin standards lately. Everybody concludes, and I agree, that he's somewhat weakened now. But the clan structures have, I think...
No, we have to totally reevaluate the clan structures.
Exactly. But I think Putin always tries to strike a balance, and there's, I think, some suggestion that maybe some of this is an attempt to limit the Siloviki a little bit. But
along with their previous
or at
discussion.
least give the appearance of
the
that,
appearance.
because I'm suspicious of anything real changing the nature of
it. Whether it will work, I doubt.
Two more small observations, if I might. Minister of Finance still Siluanov. He, I think, will be counterbalancing Belousov's spending urges.
That's going to be the key fight in the economic
That's
bloc.
why they call it a coalition government. And of course, this discussion cannot go without mentioning the new Minister of Culture, Olga Lyubimova, who has become extremely popular on social networks yesterday when active journalists and users actually went to discover her live journal of 12, I think that is 12 or 15 years old, in which, among other things, she says that she absolutely hates classical music, opera, ballet, drama theaters,
no interest in culture whatsoever.
Would not discuss her as a cultural person by any Russian standard. She literally says that, among other things, of course, criticizing the civil society and all the other things. She's also was in charge. She was also in charge at some point of one of the most notorious propagandist TV broadcast on Russia's TV channel, first TV channel, Время покажет. Also, she actually canceled the broadcasting of Stalin's Death movie in Russia and refused to do a documentary for Russia's rock musician Andrei Makarevich under pretext that we don't help our enemies. So, I mean, it's pretty straightforward.
And the fact that she is seen as an improvement over Vladimir Medinsky speaks volumes.
All you need to know about Russian
in some ways, a continuing with Medinsky, but with additional texture and color.
Right. All right, well, that's a good way to segue. In a few moments, we will continue our discussion and take a closer look at something Russia lacks that most states have and how it is driving this regime's behavior both at home and abroad. I'd like to remind you, you are listening to the Power Vertical Podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio is former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also with us in the studio is Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I'd also like to remind you, you can subscribe to the Power Vertical Podcast on iTunes. You could read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at sipa.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Well, last week's developments in Moscow illustrate something pretty fundamental about Russia today, something that helps explain Moscow's autocratic and arbitrary domestic politics, as well as its revanchist and aggressive foreign policy. And that is that Russia lacks one of the fundamental attributes of a modern state. It lacks a succession principle. It lacks a predictable mechanism for power to be legitimately transferred. And this means a few things. It means that every transition's a crisis. It means that the regime needs a legitimizing ideology, something I expect, by the way, to accompany any attempt to change the formal governing arrangements right now. And it means that it needs to discredit and delegitimize the stable democracies in the West, which do have succession principles. Maria, let's take that Ivy League PhD a years out for a spin. How important is Russia's lack of a succession principle in driving its behavior up until now? And how do you see this play out going forward?
Up until now, I do not think, honestly, the lack of succession has been a big issue for the regime, since Putin has been successfully able to, one way or another, to keep in power, navigate that, and his age and his physical condition were not a problem.
But if I may, each succession has been something of a crisis. I mean, recall how Putin came to power and the apartment bombings in 2000 in Moscow and other cities, and then the Chechen War. You had to basically start a war to make that succession operate. Next one wasn't so difficult, but you did have to do a little bit of dramaturgy. Mm-hmm. You had to do pretend Medvedev was president. Remember all those crazy rallies about Putin, the national leader, in Tver and elsewhere back in 2008. And then 2011, we had we had another crisis, which resulted in the Bolotnaya protests. And now here we are again. So you're right. It hasn't been.
But you can argue that Crimea annexation can also actually play into their argument, right? That he needed again to create this extra crisis for legitimacy reasons. Yeah.
But going forward, how do you see it?
But certainly we are approaching that moment where some kind of redesigning of the system is necessary for him to continue, and also the questions of how does he ensures certain continuity of the rule. First of all, over the recent years, we certainly have seen the first signs of the elite's alternation, right? Especially on the regional level, but also within the administration itself, there were significant signs of the replacement of the older elite groups with the younger ones, who are both younger and more technocratic, and also more dependent on Putin because they're not his peers anymore.
No, and that's interesting because I remember back in, it must have been 2012 2012, 2013, I noticed how there was this program to bring people to Moscow from the provinces to recruit a new generation. And they were carefully vetted by the security services that they were ideologically compatible with kind of Putinism, if you will.
As a matter of fact, you're absolutely right. I actually have some colleagues, friends who told me a little bit about how the screening process works. And it's extremely hard to get into this system, even at the lower level of power, unless you have some real strong connections in the security background, for example, and certainly not something completely unpatriotic, like, for example, a substantive period of studying abroad and things like that. But most importantly, that does not really address the issue of succession, right? We just see that the regime is aware of the issue and the alternation begins. There is actually some indications of continuity within the system where some of the sons of the existing ministers also take positions of power within the current government structure. If you look at the what the scholarship shows us. So, and here I'm going to bring my IV background real quick. One of the classic studies on that is Brownlee, 2011. He looked at the cases of the hereditary succession in non-monarchical autocracies, because in monarchies, I think things are relatively easy. What he finds is that the heir that is appointed by the current ruler is relatively successful in continuing the rule. When the current ruler actually has created the system or is very important for the system, and when there is the party is relatively weak. So the regime doesn't have to be a party regime, which is the Russian case. It's a personalistic regime. And second of all, the authority of the current, the existing ruler, incumbent, has to be relatively, has to have a stronger legitimacy, which I think is also our case. So looking at the 17 of our 22 cases of these successions, he actually finds that this tends to work out. Kirill Rogov, I referenced his work last time. He also looked at these cases of succession in post-Soviet space. Most of the, there were actually quite few. I just downloaded that report, actually. There were quite few of them, 4 or 5. And in most cases, actually, I think in 2 or 3 of them, it's hard to use the word most because there were quite few to begin with, the existing incumbents did not name the successor. But this did not prevent the elites from picking, from agreeing on certain person among them and actually sticking around him. So that actually tends to work quite well.
Don, you had some thoughts on succession.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this topic up, by the way, because, of course, when we were all in graduate school, the Soviet Union didn't really have an established succession either.
Well, but they kind of
they worked out sort of rules ad hoc, but there was nothing formal. And we saw competitions for power, 1964 and around Brezhnev and Gorbachev and so forth. I'm thinking about the Ivy League doctors here, data thing. I'm still more concerned, I guess I would be, than maybe what the research shows. I think this is, to some extent, a gamble for the reasons I mentioned earlier. I think that even in 99, 2000, the regime has used gimmicks to hand over power. And I think Russian people who are pretty sophisticated intelligence see that. Now, how they react is another thing at the elite level and the popular level. I do think it's a gamble. So, Brian, on your question about succession at crisis, I think it's not a crisis yet. I think people are nervous, but we're approaching it. I think this is a preemptive move by the regime to deal with it. Whether it will be successful, like I said, I have some doubts, but we'll see.
No, there's a gamble. I mean, the other thing that I keep coming back to is...
excuse me for interrupting. Brian, would you say, you and I were there at the time, would you say the Lushkov, Primakov thing was more of a succession crisis than now? I would say probably yes. But I tried to compare this today, Maria, about previous transfers of power, and to me, this is still unfolding, so it's hard to get.
What you had with the Primakov-Lushkov versus the Yeltsin family thing in 1998-99 was the elite splitting, effectively.
Yeah.
I mean, Primakov-Lushkov were representing one part of the elite, and they had power.
And that's not happening.
They had power.
Yeah.
And the Yeltsin family, Berezovsky, and that they had power. And I was expecting warfare to break out on Tverskaya Ulitsa, which runs from the Kremlin up to the Moscow mayor's office.
I agree. It was higher then. The tension was higher then.
The tension was really high, and it was really unpredictable. And I think in a lot of ways, it kind of set the precedent for Russian rule. The irony, of course, was at the time, people thought, for all its faults, the Yeltsin family was more liberal than the Lushkov-Primakov tandem. Yeah. And in reality, what the Yeltsin family produced was Putin, who ruled at least as authoritarian, in an authoritarian manner, or if not more than Lushkov-Primakov would have.
And many point out actually today that even if Primakov or Lushkov did take power at the time, they would have been dead by now. So it would still be better.
The other factor I think that bears consideration here in some unmeasurable way is the issue of property redistribution and property rights.
Yes, and that was one of the fears.
That's a pile of kindling there that Putin has done a pretty effective job.
Yeah. Well, he did. I mean, the most common
being
phrase
the umpire over how the stuff is divided.
The most common phrase on the Russian news back in the late 90s was "передел собственность." That was you heard that phrase over and over and over and over again because everybody was concerned about a redistribution of property.
Whether it's now garbage.
Now Putin did a "передел собственность." He just did.
Yes.
That is an important point, by the way, that many of these authors who work on succession point out. The succession may work smoothly for the incumbent. It never works smoothly for the elites, unfortunately, because some kind of redistribution of the authority and associated distribution of property is likely to happen afterwards. And one important difference from the cases of Yeltsin's transition to Putin and Lushkov-Primakov, at the time, Primakov and Lushkov were partly a product of a relatively strong regional rulers, right? Who Putin made sure to take under control. We can argue one of the alleged purposes of the state council is essentially to ensure the control of the regional elites, just in case, since he remembers definitely that what happened then.
I mean, one of the things, and this just kind of came to me now, but it depends whether they need to establish a succession principle, whether they need to establish a legitimizing myth, depends a lot on what they do. If the formal structures just continue and you have regular elections to a parliament and president, and where Putin is really ruling, but in a fully informal way, you don't need to worry about that. Because he doesn't have any. It's like the Gaddafi thing. What am I supposed to resign from? I don't have any post, right? So in that sense, but that's risky, and that goes back to the question I asked in the beginning. How can you rule Russia completely informally without any formal power, without the stamp, the pechat, the need for your signature on papers?
I guess I would say, Maria,
and I don't know.
I'm
know
not
the
Russian,
answer.
but I have my doubts that it can be done.
Maria, what do you think?
I think Russian political culture combines two parts. I mentioned it last time. So there's certainly one more traditionalist, more of the type of these post-Soviet republics, where I think that rule can be definitely be essentially can continue. However, there's certainly a more modernized side in the millionaire cities, and the future is on this side of the history where it's going to be increasingly difficult to do. But we do not really know, right, how informal the rule is going to be. One laws to look up to expect is actually this federal law that will actually determine what the state council is supposed to do.
Right.
Because we don't really know what it is as of now.
Yeah. No, I mean, the other thing is, this is funny. I'm working this out in real time as I draw little diagrams on my paper here. But like with Putin, you're right, Maria. Russia does have this tradition in their political culture of formal and informal rule. Both of them were embodied in Putin. Putin was the head of the formal system and the informal system for all these years. During the brief little interlude of Medvedev's fake presidency, you basically had kind of a shared formal power with Putin with all the informal power. Now we're talking about perhaps splitting the two entirely. I mean, I'm curious about how that works. It worked during the period of the tandem because Putin had de facto the formal number 2 position in the country, and
not to forget that he redistributed substantive number
power to the prime minister,
including I think the control over the Siloviki, at least in part.
Just
John?
Very interesting discussion. Go back to 89, 90. And who's to prevent a challenger to Putin, the off to the side informal leader, who's to prevent, this gets back to my point about the tension between formal and informal, who's to prevent somebody from picking up the formal powers and say, no, I'm the president, I'm the boss? Who's to prevent that? Well, he's probably going to lose, but who's to prevent that? Remember, in 89, 90, 91, Yeltsin's momentum came from popular support, where he challenged what was in some ways a bureaucratic, informal style of rule. So in Russia, your country, if I could speak for it, there are, I think, significant modernizing forces there latent who may well rally by a challenge, say, by somebody who says, no, I'm the president, I'm not nominal, Putin can go. I mean, that's very easily could happen.
As a matter of fact, as essentially insignificant as even Medvedev was in his position of the president.
The duck on the chart here.
Yeah, the duck. We already saw that happening in the period of his role.
He was doing some things that Putin didn't like.
First and second of all, he certainly saw
Libya
the elites.
resolution and
Libya,
Security
exactly.
Council.
Definitely unpopular, yes, with Putin. But most importantly, we saw that the elites realigned, and some people with more quote-unquote liberal views among the Kremlin elites, even if this word is really does not apply to them, they actually started aligning behind Medvedev, and as a result suffered quite unfortunate destiny, since they were kicked out. Many of them were kicked out of the Kremlin after Putin came, because they actually they chose the wrong horse.
Surkov and Pavlovsky. Surkov survived that. Pavlovsky did not. Dvorkovich. I mean, there were several. The elite was the liberal part of the technocratic party. The elite was coalescing around Medvedev at that time, and then they lost. But Medvedev was a weak figure. Imagine for a moment that president was Sergei Ivanov.
No, Putin actually really imagines that. That's one reason why Ivanov was not.
Can he assure from his position, from his informal position, or there will be a degree of formality to it if he is the head of the State Council or the head of the Security Council, then there will be he will have a formal seat, but can he assure that he has pliant presidents that are not going to get any ideas in their head? Medvedev can't be president forever.
Yes,
and you can't keep cloning Medvedev to be your little puppy dog president forever.
I don't want to press the comparison too strongly, but Ivanishvili is to some extent doing this in Georgia and is causing problems. And I would think on a larger scale.
Ivanishvili, he certainly is.
It's causing problems, and it's a comparable example with a westernized or westernizing formal democracy. And I think this could well happen again.
Yeah, I mean, Ivanishvili is able to do it in Georgia because his money, which I don't believe for a moment is his money. I think it's Russia's money. But it's like, I think it's like bigger than the GDP of Georgia. So when you have that much money, it's and you basically are able to finance everything. I mean, but looking at these other models, I mean, we've talked about an Iran model, but how do you make Putin into the supreme leader? How do you confer that legitimacy upon him? The China model, that's basically your 2 terms and you're out, and the elite maintains its power. I don't think Putin's interested in anything like that. The Nazarbayev model is still being tested, this kind of diffusion of power among different centers. And I still think that is the most likely scenario.
Even if the proposed amendments, as we have discussed in the first part of this broadcast, right, they do not necessarily emphasize this. The distribution of powers is not very obvious. The position of the president is still very, very strong. And unlike Nazarbayev, Putin does not have multiple relatives in power, which will preclude him from essentially ensuring the loyalty of people in control of those.
Strategically placed relatives in key places. What I think Putin is going to do is he's going to be the head of the State Council, and he is going to be head of the Security Council.
That's why you need the State Council, exactly, to be able to control, ultimately, to be the arbiter of all those.
Yeah, and as long as there is enough doubt in the minds of a president, even if the president formally has control of the Siliviki, if there's enough doubt in his or her mind as to whether will they obey me or will they obey Putin if push came to shove. And I wouldn't want to be making that gamble one way or the other, quite frankly. But that's what I where I think this is headed. But again, we're collecting data points. We're going to probably do this a few more times before we know what the hell is
That's
going on.
absolutely true. One really important point about Putin, right? He doesn't like us knowing what he wants to do.
No.
And so everything looks like this special operation of KGB style where everything is executed, implemented real fast. That's why the speed. And everyone is confused that exactly the outcome he expects. So at this point and until 2024, it's very likely that he will try to keep us all in this maze.
I'm thinking 2021 is going to be
2021, certainly when he has to signal to the elites where things are going in life before the State Duma elections, definitely. But now we also should remember that the new power structures are being tested, and that's why one of the reasons why he has started all of that now. So something may not go along the way he expects it to go.
Well, and he'll have 3 years. I think we're going to have the new power structures in place by 2021. That's obvious. And then he's got 3 years to road test this, and decide how he wants to proceed.
You sent around a very interesting program yesterday, Brian. Was it Medusa?
Shout out to my good friend Kevin Rothrock at Medusa.
And Masha Littman talked about the Kremlin taking efforts to disguise its
it's called the naked.
I think this is a bad time to do that. I know that's the style. It's his Lubyanka style, but this is, I think, a little more openness might help a situation that really is a gamble in some ways.
Yeah.
He needs to signal to the elites, that's for
I know
sure.
he doesn't like to do that.
I mean, I'm glad you brought up the Naked Pravda podcast, which is hosted by Kevin Rothrock over at Medusa. Fantastic look at the presidential administration and what happens to the presidential administration, which in fact has been the center of power. I mean, it's not by accident, I think, or it's very telling that they occupied all the old buildings of the Central Committee in Moscow. The presidential administration is really the new center of power. What happens to that in this new environment? Does the Kremlin presidential administration remain the center of power that it was, or does that power get moved someplace else? Interesting question. Highly recommend anybody out there to listen to Kevin's podcast. Thought it was very well done. So. On that note, I guess we can wrap it up for this week since we all got busy afternoons. I'd like to remind you that you have been listening to the Power Vertical podcast. My name is Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program here at SIPA. Joining me here in the studio has been former U.S. State Department official and veteran Kremlin watcher Donald Jensen, a senior fellow and editor-in-chief here at SIPA and lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. Also joining us in the studio has been Maria Snegovaya, an adjunct fellow here at SIPA and a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I think it's funny you both have the same exact two institutional affiliations. Thank you both for an enlightening and fun discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank our producer, Michal Harmata, for keeping all the lights on and all the complicated machines well-oiled and in working order throughout our discussion. I'd also like to remind you could subscribe to the Power Vertical podcast on iTunes. You can read the Power Vertical blog and watch the Vertical video at SIPA.org. And you can follow us on the Twitter at Power Vertical. Join us again next week. And now, as always, I leave you with something other than the ambient sounds of my favorite socially conscious Russian rapper, Noise MC.